Did you know that the acid-alkaline balance in the food that you're eating affects many things? It can affect the sex of your child. It can affect either a dissolving of fat, if you're bringing in alkaline elements, a dissolving of fat from the body, and even as much as affecting our emotion and our mood. That it is interesting that most of all of the substances which cause people to feel elevated or high in themselves are alkaloids.
Welcome to the Universe Inside Our Mind. This is Dr. David Jubb, and my name is Annie Jubb. Welcome today. Today we're going to be talking about living in the moment. So, living in the moment, what does that mean? What does that mean to you, David? Why don't you tell us a little bit about it?
Living in the moment is really living in this present now, letting go what it was, that's the past and the future, and really this is very bright and shiny and being associated more in this present tense, basically.
Okay, that's very interesting. Being associated in the present tense, what does that mean?
Well, as you're feeling excellent and you're moving more towards feeling excellent, excellence and feeling pleasant causes us to be more associated versus somebody who would have felt averse. Typically, the right idea is to be sort of, more dissociated, actually, and to leave behind what is aversive and move more toward what is pleasurable. And so toward and within, a person is more associated, and outside and away from people tend to be more dissociated.
Interesting. So if I'm is it true to say if I'm in a more pleasurable state, I have at least the opportunity to be living in the moment?
It's more than likely that as you're feeling pleasant in yourself, that you're living more in the moment, because it causes us to be more associated here and now, basically.
So what are other things that we can do to become more associated? It seems like the society sort of reinforces dissociation.
Yes. Well, first of all, we could talk a little bit about actually what is actually happening behaviorally as somebody is living more in this present. For instance, as we're living more in the present, we're more attuned to the outside world. Our heart is directly over and in front slightly of our buttocks, more or less. The eyes are soft and moist and relatively unblinking. And a person is a little bit more open, in their posture in this way. Typically, we reward people more for being, present and more outside versus, less than present. And if somebody was having had internal dialogue, it's possible that they might less than really be in the moment.
Internal dialogue, what does that mean?
Internal dialogue? Internal dialogue is an example of any kind of internal processing, like when somebody would have a memory. When somebody's having a memory, persons are less than really living in this present moment. Even if it was a pleasant memory, actually.
If they're having a memory, because in order to call up the memory, they go to it, so they're out of time. Is that true?
Right, more or less. When a person has a memory, they're drawing this from inside themselves. So, people could be eating a good meal, and they could have had a memory of something about the past whilst they're having their meal, and they might less than really be present for having this good meal.
That reminds me actually of an interesting thing about fear. I've I've found that actually with fear is like an out of time, out of the moment experience. Because actually, even if we're living through some traumatic, getting mauled by a bear in a car accident or whatever it would be, there's really no fear in that moment. It's time might be slowed down, or time might be changed or altered a little bit, but there's really no fear until like afterwards or before it, like the intrepidation of it might happen, or, oh, I almost got killed kind of a thing at the end. But like fear, whenever I feel fear, it reminds me that I'm actually living out of the moment, and so then I become more associated and in the moment.
Living in the moment. That is true. That is really wonderful, what Annie has said, because every emotion that we feel has physiology, and there is a content which is possible to look for in the emotion. So, for instance, if somebody was feeling had felt some anxiety, whilst that person would have been feeling that anxiety, the structural content of the emotion of anxiety would have been a person's feeling less than possibly able to manage the time of things, or less than being able to manage some circumstance. Whereas the example of someone having felt fear, this is about something unknown, a bringing of something unknown into the circumstance. Fear typically is something which is unknown, and so what Annie said is that it's an out of time context when somebody would have felt fear, and because it's something that is more or less unknown, and when somebody's living more in the present, we're living a little bit more with what is known, what we do have an understanding about, what we do believe versus what I don't believe, letting belief go and coming more from experience, basically. So whenever you ask a person to access information that's beyond their present sensory awareness, people go through a series of accessing cues to access this. And these accessing cues...
To access the memory itself, or...?
Right.
Okay.
So if you asked me to remember my mother in some moment, visually, it's possible that you would see me, draw my eyes up to this quadrant, maybe I have a finger snap or something like this, and all these things are more internal processing, and the degree to which somebody would have been internal processing, it means the person might have less than being here now, basically.
And therefore not less than living in the moment.
So go ahead.
Well, I was just going to ask you a little bit about neurology, but did you want to say something else before we go into that, or?
No.
I'm interested in the neurology behind it. Like, you're you often describe this part of the brain to do with interest and learning. What's up with that?
Well, in whole brain functioning, which is the training program that we have around the country, interest and pleasure is the major element which integrates the brain. And interest and pleasure causes more whole brain patterning, causing us to be more in the moment, more in our present tense of things, basically, which, by the way, for the viewers at home, maybe the second part of this program, we can talk about some things that they can be doing at home that you can be more aware of, living more in the moment. Something which I would like, there's quite a few places which we could go, to in this topic of living in the moment, and something I would like to mention right now, which is really one of our platform teachings in whole brain functioning, is about living in unconditional being and living in a state of non-projection, and what happens as a result of people living more in unconditional being and living in a state of non-projection.
Okay, so non-projection, that's very interesting to me. What is that, to non-project?
Okay. Projection is wherever it is that I had some behavior, or I would have behavior, that this behavior was as a result of my feelings of wanting somebody else to change. Wherever it is that I have had behavior where I've wanted somebody to change, this is projection. And wherever I would have my behavior caused because I wanted somebody else to change, you know, this is projection, and typically, you know, I've got to wash my energy field after that, and then we do all kinds of things to wash our energy field, and whilst I would have done this, I would have been living less than in an unconditional being, and you know, at home, the more that it's possible to be more at one, the more that it's possible to be more in a state of pleasantry, basically, and we're living in a state of joy, which is a more inclusive word than pleasure, because it's possible for someone to feel a little pain from their training or something, and yet, whilst they're training, and yet feel joy. So joy is a more encompassing word.
And we just have one more minute before we take a small break. What does it mean to wash your energy field?
Washing our energy fields, people often are doing all sorts of things to get back to their state of equilibrium, because our thoughts and our behaviour is continuously tuning our being, basically. And so sometimes a person has to have a good meal, they've got to go to the temple maybe and pray or something, or do some chanting, or they put some good music on, or, you know, they go to the movies, or, you know, or they sit and they've got to have a good conversation or something to actually orchestrate their energy field, basically. This is what I call washing our energy field.
Interesting. That's so fascinating. If you're interested to catch David live, we do a Tuesday night lecture here in Manhattan every Tuesday night at 8 o'clock, and that address is 208 West 13th Street. So you can come on down and catch David live, and I'm very often there too. And we're also have a school here, an educational program where we're teaching people to care for other people. How to care for their bodies.
Educating doctors of the future, and these doctors are called Phoenix physicians, and they're here in this country. We're quite a bit in New York City, and now we're in San Francisco, we're in San Diego, we're in Louisiana, we're in Oklahoma, we're in Chicago, and we're in other places.
Right around the country. So maybe we'll talk a little bit more about the Phoenix Physician Program when we come back for the second half of our show. Stay tuned.
Oh, 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 hey, oh, hey, oh, yeah, 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 whoa, 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 whoa,
Hey, welcome back to Universe Inside Our Mind. My name is Annie Jubb. This is Dr. David Jubb. And today we're chit-chatting about living in the moment. Living in the moment. And so we were talking about how we were going to offer the people at home the opportunity to, you know, some things that they can do to be living more in the moment. Some language things and some body movement things. And so why don't you start off there?
Well, for the people viewing this, it's possible for you to start to tune more into your verb tense, and for perhaps some several days to pass by, and for you totally to be tuned into your verb tense.
Okay, verb tense. What does that mean?
Well, somebody can have been saying, well, I am feeling happy, or I was feeling happy, or I will feel happy, and was and will
it's not in the moment,
would
is it?
may less than be in the moment. That's right. So it's possible to spend several days where you completely are tuned into how verb tense is being used. Are people talking about what's here now, or are they talking about what's going to be out there, or they're always talking about what's happened in the past and this kind of thing? I mean, you know, it is amazing how much people have focused on less than being in the present. And, you know, and the one thing is that yesterday tarries nothing with tomorrow, and tomorrow tarries nothing with yesterday.
Okay. So using verb tense. So So what are the things about verb tests? That must be broad, right? Is it like the difference between this and that?
Okay, there can be also words that are causing us to bring things inside, like this is a word, like a pronoun, which is bringing things inside, whereas that is a pronoun which is kind of moving things outside. And we said at the very beginning of this program that as you're feeling associated now, it is because people are more feeling pleasant, and it's within and toward versus outside and away from. Outside and away is dissociated, within and toward is more associated. So how we use direction, also, this is something that you can start to focus on. Are you focused on where you're moving in this moment, or are you focused on where you have been? You know what I mean? So the direction is important. Other ways actually is, you know, are you talking more about what is inside of us, or are you talking about what's up there? Like, you know, where people are saying a higher self, that is a value judgment being made. That's like actually people are hearing, oops, wait a minute, must have a lower self. When people have talked about higher intelligence, that's like having big intelligence or small intelligence, putting a word like this in front, which is a descriptor word, a value judgment basically. So when we would have judged another and this sort of a thing where we would have created judgment, that also is less than living in the moment. So a strategy for living more in the moment can have, which is a very useful strategy which I incorporate, is deferring my judgment basically.
So deferring your judgment, wouldn't that be living in the future?
Deferring my judgment? It's actually allowing something to be more and letting things flower and blossom.
Organically.
Yes, and less than always having been wanting to control everything, basically.
So would that be in your own language experience, or that is like a group experience, is it?
Well, we should consider, what is it that is within my control? What is this actually? If I'm focused on what I can do versus, oh, this stuff that's happening out here, blah, blah, this, that, and the other, that can have been out there, which is, again, less than in here, which is associated. Out there is dissociation. In here is, what can I do about this? How can I be? Because any person who can gain more ability and mastery over the internal state can transform anything in the outside world.
Right. It's so interesting. It's like shaping self, you know, as opposed to like wanting to shape the world, you know, shaping self. And so now, how does this play into spirituality? How do spiritual endeavors play into living into the moment, in the moment? Spirituality, really, the root word that spirituality comes from is to be joined and joining. And so, again, this is all about connection versus disconnection. Being connected and feeling my connection with things allows me to live more in the moment. Versus having had a still shot, you know, a still picture, or having had good and bad, like try to put something in a bucket more or less, or on and off type processing, which really doesn't really happen much in nature. It's more a flux of a whole of something. So what is, that was a lot of cool stuff that just went by there. What is on and off type processing? On off type processing is where somebody would have process things in a judgment way. Like, for instance, somebody would say, oh, that's a bad cloud, or gee, that tree looks like it's growing wrong. I mean, we might not say things like that because it's obvious, but people are saying things like this to other human beings, passing judgment over people, and then thus having lived in less than unconditional being, which we started out by saying that whenever we live in unconditional being, it causes us to live more in the present versus having made judgment, basically, or come from judgment in ourselves. Other kinds of things, actually, about living in the moment is what kind of a voice tone do you use? Are you communicating in a way where you're communicating just to the person listening, or could you have communicated in a way that was way past the person? Is the voice that you're listening to
pleasant? You know, is it like a song actually? Are you aware of how interesting this is? You know, the voice that you use. I feel like these are the kinds of qualities and things we really need to foster more, and it is interesting, and we are going to be doing a show on this about gender. It is interesting that females tend to be educated more in the social arts, and males tend to be educated more in the anti-social arts, and so it tends to be that a woman's voice can tend to be more aware of whether or not what she's saying and how she is attractive and interesting, versus the male, which, because his voice has been conditioned to cope with the antisocial side of life, where he's, you know, been conditioned to commit legalized sin.
Such as a war.
Yes. And so there's all these antisocial behaviours that males have been rewarded for. Males typically are rewarded for frowning, versus females tend to be rewarded more for smiling. Anyway, this is another show. But living in the moment really requires me becoming more aware of the interest and pleasantry of things, basically.
Interesting. So there is a tonal band that's much more pleasing to hear. And just as you were talking about males and females, I was just kind of commenting to myself that females have a tendency to go a little higher and faster, and males have a tendency to go a little slower and deeper with their tonal range. Would you say that's accurate?
Oh, yes. A higher, faster tone can cause people to less than remain in their bodies, versus a tone which is softer and more kinesthetic. Males' voices tend to be more kinesthetic, and we hear kinesthetic sounds which are deeper and more spaced out sounds as being close by us, whereas piercing, high-pitched sounds are more penetrating, and it's a sound which carries and moves us further away and brings us out of ourselves to more into visualizing like things versus inside feeling more.
Interesting. So, any other...
It's so amazing that there's so much actually that's possible for us to talk about as far as living in the moment. We hardly really have talked about posture and how this relates, and all kinds of ways of having thought. Yes,
and body movement, because you're known as a body language expert actually around the country. So give us one little tip, actually. Give us one body language tip, because everybody loves that. What can I do to be more associated in my body language?
You'll notice that if you're asking someone to do something, you probably want to ask somebody to do something who's like they're a little forward, they're moving a little forward, you know, versus having asked someone to do something who was leaning back, you know.
Somebody who's leaning forward is going to be much more likely to respond.
Moving forward is somebody who's more associated into the moment versus somebody who was leaning back. And these kinds of things are subtle. Somebody would have talked about their mother, and you notice that they lean forward just a tiny little bit. That's more of an association to mother versus talking about mother, for instance, and somebody having, you know, moved in a direction other than toward, meaning they had moved away. So, you know, again, we have this toward, which is association, and away from, which is dissociation, basically. So, you know, we have this little saying, actually, in whole brain functioning, that a vessel has to be in a position to be filled, versus if that vessel was pouring something out, all it really could be doing in that moment was pouring something out, actually. You know, it could never be in a position to be filled whilst it was pouring something out, basically. So how we language things can cause us to allow us to live more in the whole of ourselves by bringing more pleasantry and by bringing more whole brain patterning, versus somebody who would have framed something which is not and don't and shouldn't and must and can't, and having used modal operators of necessity versus modal operators of possibility. I wonder if you might like to. And this is interesting, and you make a statement. It causes the listeners at home to have choice in what they're hearing, basically.
We are all about choice. So anyway.
Versus limitation.
Versus limitation,
or necessity, you know.
Uh-huh. It's interesting. If something appeals to you here that you'd like to find out more information about in the future, we are every Tuesday night in Manhattan. We're at 208 West 13th Street. That's 208 West 13th Street at 8 p.m. and that's between 7th and 8th Avenue.
From 8 to 10.
From 8 to 10. And there's all kinds of interesting programs. We have a lot of plates spinning at the moment. There's a retreat that we do every year that's coming up this summer, and all kinds of interesting things. So give us a call.
This retreat that's coming up is probably one of the most sophisticated trainings on earth in language and in use of food as medicine. We hardly talked about we hardly talked about use of food as far as living in the moment. I mean, you know, a person who had sugar, I mean, and then they were given all kinds of drugs to control the hyperactivity and this sort of thing, is less than really living in the moment. There are so many things we could really be talking about. Anyway, lots of love and kisses from us.
And we'll see you next time on The Universe Inside Our Mind with Annie and David Jubb.
Just kidding, folks. You know, gosh, white bread. We have little cured ham here and things like this. Talking about hyperactivity and the kids at school, and then kind of drugging them and that sort of thing to kind of. I mean, we've got things in here which is a major drug. We've got cured ham, which is a dirty word, cure, because it means to pickle things. Basically, that word cure that you hear used. That is a dirty word. It means to pickle things, and when you cure leather, you basically pickle it, basically. But we've got some white bread here, we've got a little ham, we've got mustard, and we've got a few things in here. We've got some like iceberg lettuce, which hardly has anything in it at all. This is the kind of food that kids are eating at school. How is it possible for anybody to live in the moment if we're only being given food like this? Basically, the sugar is going to be released by the liver. For the most part, it's not even going to be recognized by the liver and cause a hyperactivity, basically. So that is really, really something. Anyway, be kind and be gentle with this information.
Hormones. Just about everybody could use more hormones. And what is the most effective way to bring hormones into our diet? Seeds and nuts, especially shiny little seeds. So either chew them really well, sprout them, or grind them to a fine meal and add them to all kinds of things to bring more hormones into your diet.